is tudom, én nem szoktak minket támogatni a gyógyszergyárak ezen a konferencián. Azt hiszem, hogy majd az eladások végén, ha netán maradna egy kis idő kávé helyett, vagy ilyesmi, akkor tudunk hozzászólásokat fogadni. Azt hiszem, szép nem került ki, de nem nincs. Még esetleg ott az ablakpárkányokban rengeteg, akik állnak, vagy idősebbeknek hagyjuk át a helyet. És akkor most visszatérő vendégünket, Lorenzo Toresinit üdvözlöm, aki Franco Bazária tanítványa és az olasz pszichiátria reform egyik prominens képviselője, és aki az etika, filozófia témát fogja számunkra kiszélesíteni. Amíg így el is kezdi Lorenzo. Hogy mondjam el, hogy manapság nagyon sokféle modell kezd terjedni a pszichiátriában, és például a budapesti egészségügyi reform kapcsán különböző belga és egyéb modellek terjednek, és hát valahogy el szoktunk felejtkezni arról, hogy Olaszország már rég megcsinálta, csak nem az angol szakirodalomban publikálják elsősorban ezeket az eredményeket, de valamint Lorenzótól hallottuk egy korábbi konferencián, hogy Olaszországban a legnagyobb pszichiátria osztály, ez 15 ágyas. Pedig valószínűleg ott is költséghatékonyabb a direkt költségek tekintetében, hogyha 350 ágyas osztályokat csinálnának, abban hatékonyabb a szertár és egyéb dolgok, de szerintem Pánka előadásából is már érthetjük, hogy mi az előnye a 15 ágynak, hogy még változik attól, hogy egy gyárba megy be az ember, ahol nagyon sok specializált funkció van, de nem feltétlenül van meg az egy szakember, aki végig mellettem van, vagy egy olyan hely, ahol mindenki ismerek, és a családszerű környezet, egy kicsi osztályban lehet. Na hát akkor, ha megvan a technikai welcome.
Köszönöm szépen. Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here. I hope you'll be able to understand my modest English. And first of all, I must say I agree with all what said the speaker before me, and I learned something about Terenzi that I didn't know very much before, and I'm very glad to have learned here. Okay. And that prepares some. So I will talk. I have a very proud, prominent theme, which I call the psychiatry, ethics and philosophy, from the psychiatric Shoah to a new renaissance in psychiatry. Let's try to be a bit optimistic if possible. Okay, first of all, history and psychiatry. History is always very important to understand who we are and where we are. Charles Darwin, together with Albert Einstein, was definitely one of the greatest scientists of modern times. By observing nature without any ideological prejudice, in a single generation, he was able to confute and discredit a series of long-held beliefs that had absolutely no rational basis before. However, following the widespread diffusion and acceptance of the theories, of his theories, his fame in scientific authority were used to validate some very pernicious applications of his thought. The biological bias, foremost among these harmful applications, is the so-called biological bias. The fact that today every pregnant woman knows that the fetus, her fetus, passes through all the evolutionary phases, from the most primitive species to the most sophisticated, so that in 38 weeks, millions of years of natural evolution are repeated in her womb, shows how Darwin's intuition and scientific explanation are now generally accepted by all. But the bias, which is the teleological inversion of evolution into evolutionism, creates a series of historical ethical, and political problems. The biological bias inevitably leads to a racial bias. The hierarchical conception of nature's evolutionary history meant that, at a certain point, the biological bias were transformed into the ontological disqualification of those categories or series or species that were classified as inferior by those who viewed and legitimized themselves as superior. In other words, thanks to a self-referential attribution of superiority that finds its scientific or pseudo-scientific basis in the theory of national evolution, certain individuals were stigmatized as inferior. When viewed in this context, Nazism appears as the emblematic and paradigmatic outcome of a conception of human life which, at a certain point, became dominant and as such was adopted without reserve by a system or political power. The term Ausmerzen, for example, embodies all these meanings in a very synthetic form. The word refers to an annual event which took place in March, when shepherds culled their lambs, considered too weak for the imminent transhumance, and sacrificed them in order to strengthen the flock as a whole. The principle, which is inevitable and has no ethical connotation in nature, was adopted by and came to constitute the ethical, social and political foundation of the Third Reich. I know everybody knows this, but it's better to recall again, to understand better what the today's situation. In 1939, at Wannsee near Berlin, during a psychiatric congress, which includes the participation of leading Nazi figures, the psychiatrists requested the authorization to apply the infamous final solution to those patients whom, in their view, were incurable and therefore destined to live a life not worth living, not worth to be lived. In 1940, the German Catholic and Protestant churches, under the leadership of Cardinal von Galen aus Münster, rebelled against this plan, the so-called P4 project, which aimed at the elimination of patients in the psychiatric hospitals. Due to the communal pressure of the Christian congregation in Germany, Hitler was forced to terminate this project 1 year later. But it was in the top of his power, can you imagine? How to say, to explain how much power that is even the time the Christian churches together could have if they wanted. Despite its brief history, the project, the T4 project, confirmed the significant link between psychiatry and the Shoah. Indeed, it is difficult to escape the conclusion that the Shoah was first inspired by a group of psychiatrists who were seeking a final solution for those patients considered unworthy of life. The Nazi authorities merely seconded the will of the psychiatrists. This has been described by Ernst Clay in 1998 in Germany. The intimate connection between psychiatry and Nazism finds its clearest confirmation in the famous slogan, "Work makes you free, Arbeit macht frei," that was posted over the main entrance to the Auschwitz concentration camp. Arbeit macht frei, a phrase that also reveals the underlying therapeutic intent of Nazi ideology. While the idea that work is liberating is certainly open to discussion, the fact that it was associated with a total institution that was oppressive, degrading and humiliating renders it automatically false and misleading. Second point, psychiatric practices. However, what really matters in psychiatry are not its theories, but its practices. As we have just seen, repressive psychiatry finds its main source of legitimacy in certain univocal biological concepts. But many existential theories can also prove to be inadequate when it comes to restoring dignity to the individual, if they are not accompanied by an explicit and pragmatic desire to liberate and restore a person's right. Restraint is one of psychiatrists' fundamental practices, to bind people, patients to their bed. Restraint. Indeed, the practice both underlies and confirms the entire theoretical apparatus of psychiatry. The whole history of institutional psychiatry is founded on the presumed necessity, inevitability and therapeutic benefits deriving from tying a patient to their bed, a procedure which is inevitably justified as being for their own good. The ideology and practice of restraint leads to what Hannah Arendt called the banality of evil. There is no doubt that the nurses and psychiatrists who tie patients to their beds, in what is clearly a form of torture and act of cruelty incompatible with the most basic sense of humanity, and with in which they would never accept if they were applied to themselves, of course, are not professionally sadists, but decent people, good mothers and fathers, and honest citizens. This is the banality of evil. We have to consider this because banalities of evil is more dangerous than cruelty. It's more easy to defend themselves from cruelty than from banality of evil, which lives among us every day today even. Personally, I believe that most of the SS were likewise decent people who, once inserted into a specific ethic context and with the forms of power placed at their disposal, lost their common ethical sense and were transformed into killers and torturers. The difference between the Nazi suppression and psychiatric restraint is merely one of quantity, not quality. Both of these actions aim at the repression and suppression of life. He spoke before of love. This is the opposite of love. This is the technique. The suppression of love, physical in the case of the Nazis, mental in the case of psychiatry. The fact that restraint can produce a so-called therapeutic result for the patient can be explained by the noted mechanism by which an individual internalizes the violence they are forced to suffer. The Stockholm syndrome, by which the victim justifies or identifies with the person who is oppressing and torturing them, is simply a way of adjusting one's external behavior to deal with that violence. The scientific paradigm, through pseudo-scientific perhaps would be the pseudo-scientific perhaps would be the more accurate term. The paradigm of total legal irresponsibility, not being in the full possession of one's faculties. It's a legal medical term, very common, is clearly based on the biological bias that derives from an evolutionist approach and perspective. Based on this paradigm, the identity of the so-called bearers of unreason can be constructed. It means persons who, by definition, are not able to act according to the dictates of reason, and thus are not responsible for their actions. Such persons are clearly dangerous, obviously. The aim of uprooting madness from the brains of such persons, madness which was understood and defined in purely organic terms, and with the person suffering from these disorders viewed as biological determinated and irreversibly so, led society and its technical mediator, the psychiatrist, to develop some extreme therapies. Two of the most devastating of these therapies, electroshock and leucotomy, violate and harm the organ of thought in a way that is totally disrespectful of the individual's subjectivity and psychiatry as a guarantee and the asylum as a blackmail. How do you say blackmail? The person with a mental disorder was thus considered by so-called science and the collective imagination as an inferior being, and therefore incapable of determining their own healing processes. Being without responsibility, also legally, it followed that if the mentally ill person committed a crime, someone else had to answer for it. Wherever in the world there are asylums and institutional psychiatry, when a patient commits a crime, the responsibility for that crime is shifted onto the psychiatrist who did not foresee this crime and therefore took no action to prevent it. This is quite similar to someone who owns a crocodile, a tiger or a bull, and who is thus held legally responsible, both criminally and in terms of financial compensation, if these dangerous beasts should cause damage or harm someone because they were allowed to roam freely. Darwinism has been used to support this view. It also underpinned the hypothesis, which gradually became a certainty, that madness stems from the predominance of the pallium over the neopallium, means the intermediate over the upper cortex of the brain. The pallium is also the site of the olfactory sense and emotions in a modern man, while the neopallium provides the organic substratum of self-aware thought and the higher functions. But the pallium also constitutes the upper cortex of reptiles. Hence, based on this theoretical approach, a human being gifted with madness is ultimately a sort of crocodile. Very simple. The legal responsibility of the crocodile owner for the damage his pet may cause when transferred into the psychiatric domain in Italy is called the position of guarantee. In Trieste, the city where I've been working 25 years, then changed city, in the years of deinstitutionalization, this is the most important term. When the psychiatric hospital was being shut down, there was not a single psychiatrist who was not accused and tried for crimes committed by their patients, minor or major crimes. This was also the case elsewhere in Italy. It was no accident that this occurred in the period in which the total institution was being challenged. In our country, an institution, the asylum, which many saw as a safeguard against the presumed danger or dangerousness of psychiatric patients. However, this attitude continued to have a legal implication until very recently. For example, in the year 2000, final sentence 2008, psychiatrist in Imola, near Bologna, was convicted for a murder committed by one of his patients. While in France, another colleague in Marseille, Dr. Daniela Canarelli, was convicted in her first trial for a similar crime committed by a patient. The conviction was struck down on appeal. Compulsory treatment. Like any technician who has a set of specific tools in order to do their job, the operators who are delegated to normalize the abnormal have always been provided with various means, legal, institutional and therapeutic, to deal with madness. It is society and the state that provides these instruments and requires that they be used as prescribed by law by psychiatrists. For many years, the primary tool was the total institution, the primary and only tool, disguised as a hospital, means the therapeutic workshop. Another tool which is still in use today is compulsory treatment. And the procedure or action most commonly connected with this form of treatment is the restraint. However, the procedure leads to a self-justifying and viciously circular application of compulsory treatment. This means that the more one restrains, the more one shows that the restraint is needed. It's clear. It's a vicious circle. Third point, psychiatry and philosophy. Raison et déraison. The inventory of raison necessarily led to the invention, by deduction one might say, of déraison. I use the French because the invention was first patented in the nation of Voltaire. Raison automatically implies the existence of unreason. Reason automatically implies the existence of unreason. Raison et déraison. Reason also justifies itself by unreason. After Enlightenment, in 1838, France created asylums, which soon became monuments to unreason. They function as a sort of lighthouse, a warning to the rest of the world with respect to unreason. There is so the others are free from unreason. The asylum said, "Within my walls are madness and the man." It thus provided a very reassuring message for the rest of the society. Original sin as a self-definition. Let's go to philosophy. The reign of reason was the final stage of a very long process that began with the auto-deification of man as APA, who, by mastering fire, had escaped from the automatic rule of nature and acquired free will, that today we call the possession of one's faculties. This transformation constituted the real original sin, described in the biblical myth of the Garden of Eden. But despite his self-deification, the more atavic thought of man continued to remain attached to nature for tens of thousands of years, viewing and treating it as a divinity. Recently, scholars have shown that there is both a weak and a strong form of polytheism. The first is polytheism without hierarchy, while the second, instead, has some form of hierarchy. The polytheism without hierarchy is shamanism. The basic tenet of shamanism is that very animated and inanimate beings possess a soul. Every tree has a soul, every animal, every mountain has a soul. In this non-hierarchical polytheism. Instead, with the polytheism with hierarchy is what we find in Greco-Roman mythology. Jupiter, Juno, and the other deities such as Apollo and Venus, as well in Germanic mythology, Wotan, Odin, Brunhilde, and so forth. The evolution from a weak polytheism without hierarchy to a strong polytheism with hierarchy concludes in the third phase, which is monotheism. It is so simple, isn't it? This is basically the projection of man's own deification onto an external and superior being who maintains all the anthropomorphic characteristics, but who remains superior and upon whom human beings can thus also project their desire for power and omnipotence. This mechanism of projecting the status of a god onto an external other took place over many thousands of years. But the sense of divine is what man discovered in himself, with the recognition of his own free will. The capacity of controlling fire, for instance, that made us become men from animals. And we must also ask ourselves what the ultimate goal of this specific form of consciousness, which we can call religious, was, or is. Today we can say that the evolution of human thought towards monotheism was functional to the introduction of the sense of guilt. This is for me very important. In previous stages of human development, the sense of guilt did not exist as such. At most it was perceived as a sense of shame or dishonor. The sense of guilt is undoubtedly the most formidable tool that mankind has ever excogitated for the purposes of exercising and maintaining power, as it works internally, impacting directly on what we call our conscience. The sense of guilt introduced by monotheism allows us, a minority with power, to effectively control the majority. Very simple. When Moses came down from the mount after his encounter with the monotheistic Jehovah and discovered his people worshipping the golden calf, he tried in vain to oppose the abomination that was taking place. Moses, who was bearing the tables of the law, it means ethics, tried to pit this law against the non-ethical god of money. Today, the golden calf has grown into a bull, whose image now stands before the New York Stock Exchange, Wall Street, as a symbol of its dominance and superiority, together with the other deity born out of the French Revolution, the goddess Reason. Now, let's arrive to the magic word. However, the evolution of the projection of man's divinity beyond himself follows an order which is logical, not necessarily chronological. Monotheism and polytheism coexist through the world today, with the polytheism divided into forms that have a hierarchy and those who without it, for instance, Hinduism. And another example of polytheism without hierarchy can be found in Siberian shamanism. The adepts of this form of shamanism believe the earth is sacred, and each day they ask the goddess for forgiveness for the harm they and the rest of humanity have caused to it. Shamans of Siberia hear voices and have visions. During the Soviet period they were diagnosed and confined in psychiatric institutions, of course. After 1995, many shamans found the courage to resume their sacred mission, but magic continues to play an important role in Western society, even if we don't know it. The sacrality of the earth, for instance, is found in very synthetic form in the sacred connotations of the endometrium. In the female anatomy, this represents the ability to generate and recycle, like the Holy Earth. And we all worship endometrium. Ladies and gentlemen, however, modern rational man systematically suppresses this phenomenon and in particular conceals the fact that it occurs in relation with the phases of the moon, something which science has never been able to fully explain. This means we are dealing with the daily and monthly element of collective magic, and we don't want to think about this, but we live in this magic identity of time. All of us. Mankind thus continues, in my very modest opinion, to worship the endometrium unconsciously. A reality which underlies all the behaviors and forms of power connected with gender. The fact that the matriarchy no longer exists is essentially a question of superstructure. But it basically exists in my opinion. The matriarchy is sustained ideologically by nature, which endowed one sex with more capabilities and potency than the other. And yet, this increased capability and potency has no value in today's society. This situation, which is at the root of so many problems and misunderstandings, almost appears as one of nature's practical jokes. The world of magic is still alive and well in children. In fact, adults remain fascinated and enthralled to the one child's need for an intimate relationship with magic, as we find in fairy tales. Christmas tree, and Easter, the egg, We could even give a magic value to carnival with phrases has shown wonderful golden and so on and so forth. The Russian Matrioskas, what do you think of Russian Matrioskas? Can likewise be seen as representing the stratification of human identity, one identity in one of the other of ourselves. My daughter, when she was pregnant, said to me, you know, we are one side of the other. She and her daughter, her two children. And so you are Matrioskas, of course. That is to say, one of us is a sort of Matryoshka. Each one of us is a sort of Matryoshka, with all our mental ages layered one over the other. The outermost layer is our present self, while the inner nucleus is the child self of ourself, which is archaic and magical. So we have the magic inside of ourselves. Let us never forget this. While adults enjoy and appreciate the world of magic, if someone continues to refer excessively to children, if someone continues to refer excessively to their inner and outer magical world, when he is adult, sooner or later will receive a diagnosis and being a carer of medicalization. History is full of examples of adults who continue to live within and reproduce magical world around themselves. In other historical periods, such persons were called saints. If Saint Francis were alive today, he would certainly be a subject of psychiatric interest, with diagnosis, therapies, and interdiction, guardianship, Santa Caterina, and so on. Madness and if I want, I can conclude. I have not very many slides anymore. Just in order to consider that the so-called madness represents only the presence of the magic world, of the magic past world that is in everybody, in each of us, in those people who are stigmatized, stigmatized because the rationality does not accept the unreason, and this is and all this can be understood only if one does the psychiatrist. We do all together this dismantlement of that monument of the unreason, which is the mental hospital, the so-called mental hospital, which is a concentration camp that does not allow a psychiatrist to learn to speak the other languages, because everybody speaks his language, and we claim that every patient speaks the central language, the language of us, and we must be able to speak their language. And this discovery that has been done in England, in Italy, now it's becoming throughout the world, is the deinstitutionalization of psychiatric hospitals, psychiatric institutions, is somehow, in my very modest opinion, a new renaissance. Because today it becomes lesser and lesser clear that on one part is reason, on the other part is unreason, but in everybody, in each of us, is living together reason and unreason. We enter, all of us, how many are we? 100 might be people. Enter again the world of our unreason or of our schizophrenia every evening when we go to bed and start sleeping and having dreams. That's all. That's the next one.
Lorenzo. Magyarul mondom, mert úgyis van. Maybe you will need a translator. A szervezőt kérem, hogy a Danielének hozzanak egy gépet. And maybe you can volt talán 2 évvel ezelőtt egy konferenciánk a segítő új identitásáról, és ott nekem erre a kérdésre az egyik személyes válaszom, hogy azzal jó, ha sose vagyunk semmiben se biztosak. meg az ellenkezőjében sem biztosak, és ez egy nagyon nehéz szerep, mert az ember nem találja, hogy most melyik Matjóska papával van éppen, és mindig kell a másikra is figyelni. És úgy gondolom, hogy nagyon nagy bemutatkozás volt mind a két első előadás, ami abban segít minket, hogy mindig legyen kérdőjel is akkor, amikor dolgozunk. Nekem visszafelé is vannak kérdőjeleim egyébként. A Bordos Erika, akit sokan ismernek itt, és akiről én azt gondoltam mindig, hogy elsősorban azért bízta engem, vagy nem tudom én, mert én is ilyen közösségi pszichiáter vagyok, azt mondta, hogy egy dolgot el kell ismerni, te tudsz legjobban gyógyszerelni. Ezt mondta nekem a közösségi pszichiátria másik kiemelkedő személyisége. Ez például egy olyan mondat, amin el kell gondolkodni a mai előadások fényében is. És hát hagyj menjünk is tovább, hát amíg egyszer egyszerű kérdésekre is. Tulajdonképpen azt mondom, hogy ez az új szakmai identitás, ez lett kicsi. Vagy még visszajönnek? Nem. Ja. Hogy akkor egy-két ülőnél tudunk adni. Személy szerint most Bánfalvi előadására, Attila előadására utalok, én már eljöttem arra, hogy az egy nagy hátrány, hogyha az ember azon az oldalán az asztalnak, ahol a fiók van, és hogy tulajdonképpen elég sok ártalmas hatás jön ezekből a dolgokból, amikor valami módon mi fölényben vagyunk. És hát Lorenzo előadásában több szempontot is hallottunk arról, hogy amit én is gondolok, hogy nekünk pszichiátereknek jó tudomásul vesszük, meg úgy általában pszichosegítők tudomásul vesszük, hogy ez egy veszélyes üzem hozzánk bejön. És hogy el kell fogadjuk, hogy ezért, hogy mondjam, én azt mondom, hogy jó lenne bocsánatot kérni, vagy valami ilyesmi azokért a dolgokért, amit a pszichiátria nevében történnek emberekkel. És személy szerint ennek számomra, amit a munkatársaim számára szoktam mondani, meg a hallgatóim számára úgy szoktam fogalmazni, hogy vendégségbe jönnek hozzánk, és viselkedjünk úgy, ahogy a vendégekkel szokás. Mondhatjuk úgy is, hogy dialógus legyen. De ennek van egy szervezeti része, meg még kettesben csak összejön egy dialógus, vagy hármasba. De hogyan tud egy ilyen institution, egy szervezet dialógust csinálni? És akkor arra jöttem rá, hogy a legjobb, ha kivonjuk a terápiákat a szervezetből, például az úgynevezett szocioterápiákat, mert azok valahogy mind arra alapozódnak, hogy van valami szakértő, aki megreparálja a vendégeket, azokat, aki valami változást fog rajtuk végrehajtani. És azt gondoltam, hogy ez a helyzet, ez többet árt, mint használ. És akkor arra gondoltam, hogy létrehozzuk a káosz alapú szervezeti kultúrát, amit a konferencián is jól működik. Látják az előadó a földön, a Svájcból a vendégek állnak, és minden elcsúszik, de valahogy mindig jól szoktuk azért érezni magunkat, és az ébredés a kapitványnál is így működünk, hogy hihetetlenül zavaros működésmód van, és hogy igyekeztünk az ilyen csoportos mintomenniket úgy intézni, hogy hát ha valaki akar valamit, hadd csinálja, és nem terápiákat csinálunk, hanem mondhatni, hogy önsegítő csoportokat, éppen irodalmárok, ha be akarnak jönni, vagy akarnak festeni, vagy a fene tudja, mit akarnak. Na most itt van még Nemes László, aki az egyik ilyen fene tudja, mit akar volt számomra. Besétált egy filozófus az ajtó, mondta, hogy ő itt szeretne csinálni valami filozófiai terápiát. Ugye valaki mondtam, hogy terápiát nem lehet csinálni, mert az tilos, de mondjuk filozófiai kávéház lehetne. És hát eleinte én úgy gondoltam, hogy hát még egy csodabogára itt mindenki elfér nálam. Én is az vagyok, majd erről az eladásokban fogok még beszélni. És aztán közben rájöttem, hogy hát ennek nagyon helye van. Ma is rájöttünk arra, hogy filozófikus gondolkodás, filozófusok tudnak nekünk támpontot adni, amikor a matkoska babák közt nem találjuk, hogy hol vagyunk mi. És a tánctól is van olyasmit hozott be, ami nagyon életre kelt. A résztvevők, a kávéház résztvevői a legkedveltebb valaminek tartják nálunk a házban, nem a terápiának, csak egyetlétnek talán, és közben volt módom arra is rálátni, hogy László közben meg egy tudós is, aki egy utcai filozófiát csinál, és hogy egy egész új irányzatot hozott el, és ennek a mai rendezvénynek lényegében az ő munkássága adta az ötletet, úgyhogy azt hiszem eleget beszéltem át is.
Köszönöm szépen!